Hello, everyone, and welcome on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences. I am Claire Davison. I am an engagement officer in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I will serve as your moderator today. Thank you so much for joining us for Book Club. Today, we will discuss Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, selected by Department of English leaders and faculty. So a big thank you to Jacob Reisinger, Assistant Professor in the Department of English, and Jennifer Schnabel, Assistant Professor and English Librarian at the University Libraries, for sharing their expertise with us today. So Jake and Jennifer will get us started with some opening remarks about Frankenstein, and then we will open up the conversation to all of your comments and questions. So Jake, take it away.
All right. Well, hey, thanks everybody for tuning in. April's a kind of crazy month here at OSU. So if you're on campus, you know that. But if not, welcome. I mean, it's a lucky day to talk about Frankenstein here in town, because I feel like I sort of woke up this morning and was greeted with a real blast of alpine sublimity. Not quite the Alps, but it was a really, really snowy morning in Frankenstein. So it kind of set the tone. This is a collective conversation. And, when you're approaching Frankenstein, that to me seems key, because this is a book, to me, that seems a lot about the dangers of solitude and the salutary power of relationship, society, and family. So if you have read carefully, you'll notice that in this novel, there are three figures, three readers who could really, really, really use a book club. So, Captain Walton at the beginning of the novel, as a young whippersnapper, talks about how he is, quote unquote, passionately fond of reading histories of voyages. And so he kind of just goes to his uncle's house and reads about voyage after voyage. And of course, grows up to get himself in a real pickle on a voyage of his own. Victor Frankenstein, as a young man, reads Cornelius Agrippa and Paracelsus, and he approaches them like they're the kind of hot new scientists on the scene rather than antiquated alchemists. And I always keep thinking, if he had had a book club, this whole disaster could have been averted. And in fact, he kind of faults his father, like, Dad, why didn't you tell me that I was reading antiquated science? But, so again, book club. Then, of course, there's the creature who himself probably gets closest to the experience of an OSU undergraduate when he, kind of finds randomly in a field in Germany, three books. Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther, Milton's Paradise Lost, and Plutarch's Lives, which I was trying to think about, when he reads these three books and makes a kind of assessment about humanity and human culture based on the books, and it's trying to figure out like how to translate that into modern terms. And I think it would be kind of like reading Nicholas Sparks, Robert Frost in a book about the founding fathers, and then kind of imagining that you just sort of knew how the human race works. So, and I think, all three of these examples to me say that the path to knowledge is happiest and probably also safer when there's company around. What's true of reading habits, in this book seems a broader preoccupation of the novel. And this isn't really my own hot take on it, but something of a critical preoccupation. And for my money, the scholar Mary Poovey puts it best, and this is what she says about Frankenstein. So I'll read you a quote. She says, "For Mary Shelley, imagination is an appetite that can and must be regulated specifically by the give and take of domestic relationships. As long as domestic relationships govern an individual's affections, his or her desire will turn outward as love. But, okay, and this is the key part, when the individual loses the regulating influence of relationship with others, imaginative energy always threatens to turn back on itself." And as I was thinking about it this morning, that last sentence, seemed more vital and resonant to me, in a post-pandemic world, than it did when I taught this book the last time. When the individual loses the regulating influence of relationship with others, imaginative energy always threatens to turn back on itself. Now, I mean, to gloss this insight, if you're like Victor Frankenstein and you spend 6 years in a lab in Ingolstadt without ever making the trip home to Geneva to visit your family, things are going to start to go bad quickly. I mean, you need that family connection, that kind of social connection to regulate your affections or to kind of see the world rightly. Now, I mean, we all know, I mean, my 3-year-old knows Frankenstein. I mean, she's never read it, obviously, but she knows who Frankenstein is. Mary Shelley's novel has been hijacked, I think, kind of productively and amazingly hijacked by Halloween. So in other words, the way in which we imagine Frankenstein is a bit different from the novel itself, but it's worth remembering that Victor Frankenstein early on stakes out a claim as himself being a kind of Halloween averse kind of person. He doesn't really like superstitious things. So if you'll permit me to do the English professor, I'm just going to read a quick passage, and just from chapter 3 in the first volume. And this is how he puts it. To examine the causes of life, we must first have recourse to death. I became acquainted with the science of anatomy, but this was not sufficient. I must also observe the natural decay and corruption of the human body. And there's that real, I can't just know about it, but I've got to see it. And he then goes on to explain why it is that statement doesn't really freak him out. He says, in my education, my father had taken the greatest precautions that my mind should be impressed with no supernatural horrors. I do not ever remember to have trembled at a tale of superstition. In other words, no ghost story can scare this guy, or to have feared the apparition of a spirit. Darkness had no effect upon my fancy, and a churchyard was to me merely the receptacle of bodies deprived of life, which from being the seat of beauty and strength had become food for the worm. Now I was led to examine the progress and cause of this decay and forced to spend days and nights in vaults and charnel houses. So in other words, Victor basically describes himself as someone who can hang out in a graveyard night after night, never get scared, never feel like there's going to be a ghost or a monster or like a tall green figure kind of coming behind him. And I mean, this to me seems kind of key. But okay, if the novel isn't about supernatural horrors or darkness, what is it? And I guess to me, I mean, it could be so many things, but family and relationality and the obligations they entail seem like such a big piece of the puzzle. So I wanted to close by just saying a couple of things about Mary Shelley's family, because to me this seems like a really exciting and interesting context that can help us, think about Frankenstein in a different way. So Mary Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was the foremost and most notorious feminist thinker in the 1790s in Britain. She boldly called for equal education for women, which was a very, forward-thinking position in that moment, and so advocated what she called a revolution in female manners, so that women could labor by reforming themselves to reform the world. Now, so that's her mother. Her father, William Godwin, was the foremost radical political philosopher of the day, and I mean his writings, if you read them, are sort of bonkers. And I'll just give you two quick cases of this. I mean, one of his most notorious positions is that you should always do the better thing for the world and set your personal emotional investments aside. So his way of talking about this was it's kind of thought experiment. He said, imagine that your attic is on fire. And, there are two people in the attic. One of those persons is your mother, and the other one is some person who could advance the cause of justice worldwide, who should you save? And Godwin said, without even thinking about it, save the person who can do the most for justice worldwide, and forget about your mother. Let her burn. And all right, I mean, you can imagine what it's like to be Godwin's mother or to be Godwin's daughter. It's a very, strange and kind of idiosyncratic position about family ties. He also thought that if you, were rational and you allowed your rationality to thrive, eventually your mind might become so powerful that it could just conquer disease itself. You could just kind of think your way out of being sick. I mean, again, this was a thing he wrote and published. And when these two radical thinkers met for the first time, they hated each other. A few years later, they met a second time and they fell madly in love. And Godwin kept a kind of crisp, straight-laced, scaled-down diary. And every time he would have a say, conjugal visit with Mary Wollstonecraft, he would put a little X in the corner of his diary. And one of these little X's resulted, of course, in Mary Shelley. These two radical thinkers decided to get married, but being the radicals they were, they decided they would each keep their separate apartments, so they would have space to write and think and live. And about 100 years later, Virginia Woolf really admired that arrangement. She kind of looked back to Mary Wollstonecraft in that way as someone really important. But Mary Wollstonecraft did not survive the birth of her daughter, Mary Godwin, who would go on to become Mary Shelley. So that's kind of the context of her parents. Flash forward 17 years. Mary Godwin meets Percy Shelley, a poet and reformer who was himself married at the time. They eloped a few months later after first consummating their relationship, so the story goes, on Mary Wollstonecraft's grave. About 9 months later, Mary Shelley gave birth to a daughter prematurely who died several days later. And I think it's a kind of interesting note or context that in the years surrounding Frankenstein, before and after its publication, Mary Shelley would lose 4 children. So, I mean, the kind of the question of what it takes to create and sustain and be a parent to a life is something that is on her mind a lot in these years. And okay, a year and some change after that, Mary and Percy headed to Geneva with Mary's stepsister and Lord Byron. And in that year without a summer, they had a ghost story competition that resulted in Frankenstein. Mary Shelley was 19 years old at the time. So, I mean, when, I don't know, most of us are writing, college essays or something like that, she was finishing Frankenstein. And if we call the novel Frankenstein, but if you look at the original title page, Mary Shelley called it Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. And, I mean, I guess you could say that Mary Shelley imagined herself as revising a myth or updating it. But it seems to me that in the process, she birthed a new myth, one of our most powerful myths, one that has continued to reverberate for over 200 years, which seems, not bad for a 19-year-old.
Thanks so much, Jake. Now over to Jen.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here with us today. For my opening remarks, I'm going to focus on reading Frankenstein as a mystery or crime novel. So bear with me as I make some points. While revisiting the novel for this event, I was considering how we might read Frankenstein as not only a science fiction or horror novel, but also considered an early example of the crime fiction or mystery genre, especially as later stories of crime and detection were certainly influenced by Gothic literature. Several mysteries arise in narratives, both for the reader and for the characters. So the first major mystery occurs when a stranger arrives on the ship, on Captain Walton's ship. Who is he? Walton's letters to his sister, who just happens to have the same initials as Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley herself, Mary Godwin Shelley, serve as a frame for Frankenstein's tale. The letters do, and eventually provide some answers to this mystery. The second mystery is, where does the creature go? The creature is missing from the apartments when Frankenstein returns, and somehow he's relieved and not concerned, which I don't know if we would have done the same thing. He doesn't learn anybody or seem to be too worried. He just focused on his own relief. But we eventually find out what happens to the creature. Where did he go? What has he been doing? We do hear from the creature later through Victor's retelling, though. Of course, multiple murders take place in this novel. Frankenstein's younger brother, William, his murder. If it's not the falsely accused Justine, then who is it? So that's another mystery. Victor eventually suspects the creature, and I quote from Volume 1, Chapter 6, Victor says, 2 years had now nearly elapsed since the night on which he first received life. And was this his first crime? Alas, I had turned loose into the world a depraved wretch whose delight was in carnage and misery, had he not murdered my brother. We have an alibi pop up where Victor is tried for Henry's murder, his friend Henry, and he does have an alibi, and that lets him off. So that's another crime fiction element that we see in here. Frankenstein and the creature take turns in the roles of investigators, the investigated, the pursuer, the pursued, the perpetrator, and the victim. So there's that doubling there where they kind of switch back and forth between those roles throughout the narrative. We see several clues pop up in this novel. The monster tells Frankenstein that he found pages from his journal in a pocket of a coat that he took from the apartment. And that's how he locates the hometown of his creator. The monster plants the necklace on Justine to implicate her. So this is sort of a red herring, right, that we see in traditional mystery novels. And there are other crimes, of course, and besides the murders. We might say the primary crime of the whole novel is Victor creating and then abandoning the creature in the first place, withholding the truth from his family and friends, and ultimately responsible for their deaths as well. We also see a lot of examples of punishments for these crimes in various ways. So the monster is punishing Frankenstein after he does not fulfill his promise to create a female companion for him. He threatens, "I will be with you on your wedding night." And Frankenstein's intent to punish the monster, quote, "They were dead and I lived," talking about his family. "Their murderer also lived, and to destroy him, I must drag out my weary existence." So then we have some more clues as the creature leaves him little messages and whatnot as Victor pursues him all the way to the North Pole. We have some smaller mysteries buried in there. The other characters, as Jake was talking about family and being isolated from family, the other characters are concerned about Victor's mental and physical health throughout. What's wrong with him? He's not being honest with us. We don't really know what's going on. He's keeping this from even his wife, and we know how that turns out. Finally, I'll add that the epistolary format, the letter format, only heightens the suspense as the plot is slowly revealed. And we can't assume the narrators are always reliable. So I was struck by Walton's comments in one of the final letters to his sister. Quote, "Frankenstein discovered that I made notes concerning his history. He asked to see them and then himself corrected and augmented them in many places, but principally in giving the life and spirit to the conversations he held with his enemy. Since you have preserved my narration," he said he, "I would not that a mutilated one should go down to posterity." So there's lots of elements of the unreliable narrator here. I think this passage captures it really well. So Mary Shelley may have been influenced by her father, William Godwin's novel, which was based on a lot of his political writings, The Adventures of Caleb Williams, published in 1794, which many scholars consider the first detective or thriller novel in English literature, or at least a precursor to the genre. In the story, Caleb Williams, the first person narrator, discovers his employer is a murderer and is threatened with death because he's aware of the secret. He flees, and then various pursuits and framings ensue. So you can look into Caleb Williams as well if you're interested. One issue though is we don't have a clear conclusion to Frankenstein. And this is an ending that is unlike a traditional mystery novel, but it adds to the suspense. So the creature tells Walton, quote, "But soon I shall die, and what I now feel be no longer felt. Soon these burning miseries will be extinct. I shall ascend my funeral pile triumphantly and exult in the agony of the torturing flames. The light of that conflagration will fade away. My ashes will be swept into the sea by the winds. My spirit will sleep in peace, or if it thinks, it will not surely think thus, farewell." And as Walter Scott writes in his own review of the novel in Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine, whether this singular being executed his purpose or not must necessarily remain an uncertainty, unless the voyage of discovery to the North Pole should throw any light on the subject. So I tend to think the creature did execute his purpose, but perhaps the monster is still out there, so we don't know.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jen. Our first question was submitted in advance. The question is, why is modern Frankenstein's monster portrayed as a brain-dead killing machine?
Thank you for submitting that question in advance. It gave me some time to prepare. So I'm going to share my screen just to show a few images of representations of the monster, and that might help us get to at least one of the answers or two of the answers. So I think there are several answers to that question. I'm going to come up with two. One is that in subsequent representations of Frankenstein and this tale and the monster does not speak. The monster grunts a lot, and the monster is not giving impassioned speeches about his loneliness and his abandonment. So I think that is a way that he's become dehumanized in some of the representations that we're used to seeing today. So this image is from a play, a performance of a play. Actor T.P. Cook as Frankenstein's monster in the 1823 production of Presumption or The Fate of Frankenstein. And I skimmed the script to this, and I did not see any place where the monster actually speaks. So this is 5 years after the initial publication of the novel. So I just wanted to, and all these images are available freely online. You can find them. Here we have an engraving from 1831, from the 1831 edition, and we see the monster here. This is not the Frankenstein's monster that we're used to seeing. You can see he's more like a man than a monster. Here we have another representation. Sorry. There we go. Yeah, so this is from the Frankenstein silent horror film from 1910. Very unlike the creature we're used to seeing. So I would say the second answer to the question, in addition to Frankenstein's voice being silenced in a lot of the representations that we see after the initial publication of the novel, is the influence of, I would say, the 1931 film starring Boris Karloff. This is the makeup job that the makeup artist did on him. And he's appeared in two movies since that initial Frankenstein film. This still is from Bride of Frankenstein from 1935. But as you can see, sort of that machine, if we're talking about a killing machine, right? You're seeing the bolts in the neck. This is the first time we're going to see that. And this is the image, add the green skin that we're used to seeing in contemporary depictions, cartoons, cereal boxes, inflatable monsters that Jake found on eBay to put in the library. So, and you can see, this is sort of a jolly monster, but he still has some of those elements from that 1931 depiction in the film. And I think that was so popular, and that sort of has stayed in our imagination. So I hope that answers a little bit of the question.
If I can jump in for a second too, it's a fun book to teach. When I first started teaching at OSU, I kind of made a pledge to myself that I would never teach Frankenstein, because it seems like a book that a lot of people have read in some other context. I think when someone did a compilation of the most studied books in college. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is the only novel to make the top 10 list, and it's like number 4 and number 5. But okay, I broke the pledge for the bicentennial anniversary of Frankenstein, and it was so fun to teach. I've kind of given it up, and part of the fun is that everyone has a certain expectation about Frankenstein based on its kind of cultural mythology, and that expectation is really a Gothic horror one. And when you read volume 1 or volume 3 of Frankenstein, that expectation is relatively sustained. There are a lot of cinematographic moments in which that they're just scary and terrifying and eerie, like when the creature wakes up and you see his large yellow eye just kind of peering at you. But what that leaves out is volume 2, which is the creature's account of his own experience, and it's sort of like a little piece of Enlightenment philosophy in the middle of two bread-like pieces of Gothic horror. And when the monster tells his own tale, that's when you really get the complexity and nuance of his character. But it's all retrospect and no action. From a film perspective, how do you show the monster learning how to read, or how do you show the monster? So it's been part of the novel that doesn't translate as well into film, and so it's the thing that's kind of easiest to drop out. And when you take away his account of his own development and education, you lose a big piece of his humanity. Hence, like the more mechanized images that Jen puts on the screen that my 3-year-old knows.
I'll also add too, I did pull out, speaking of volume 2, Jake, I think what people were doing, I'm glad that you said that, when they're making films, I think they maybe looked at volume 2 and sort of pulled out bits and pieces that could be filmed. And I think that sort of like aggressive monster, vengeful monster is easier to do and pops out. So there's a quote in chapter 8 that I wanted to read. This happens after the DeLacys chase him out of their cottage. And he says, "When night came, I quitted my retreat and wandered into the wood, and now, no longer restrained by the fear of discovery, I gave vent to my anguish in fearful howlings." So that's something we see, in various depictions of the monster. "I was like a wild beast that had broken the toils, destroying the objects that obstructed me, and ranging through the wood with a stag-like swiftness." And he goes on to say, "I, like the arch fiend, bore a hell within me. And finding myself unsympathized with, wished to tear up the trees, spread havoc and destruction around me, and then to have sat down and enjoyed the ruin." So I think that makes a lot of sense with what you were saying as far as, not using the rest of volume 2.
Got a question here from Susan. It seemed to me that Victor wanted to create a Superman that is taller and stronger than most, etc. But later, that is what he regrets. Victor does a lot of catastrophizing about the problem of the monster and passes up a lot of opportunities to do anything about the monster's behavior and whereabouts. Why is Victor so ineffective?
What a great $1 million question. Why is Victor so ineffective? I feel like surely some of the other characters in the novel are thinking this from time to time. Like maybe his, fiance Elizabeth. It's been 8 years and we're still not married, and you still are just despondent all the time. But I don't know if I have a great answer to the question, but I think it's a really fascinating one to think about. And one way I always think about it is that Victor's espoused position is to create as beautiful a creature as possible, to make it grander than normal human beings and more elegant, and all of a sudden he adds the spark of life to the creature, and all that beauty is for naught. Like it's as though all of that design just turns into ugliness. And I always find myself thinking, if he was constructing this being out of corpse parts, wouldn't he have realized a little bit earlier in the process that what he was making was ugly? What is it that isn't clear about his process that produces, such an unexpected result for him in a way. That's a first thought.
I remember hearing someone comment that Victor would never have gotten this through the Institutional Review Board. So perhaps that's one reason why he was able to kind of just haphazardly, push this through without so much thought. Nobody was really there to stop him. He wasn't sharing what he was trying to do, or if he was, it was just people weren't really aware of what he was doing. And again, with the isolation that Jake talked about from the beginning.
Yeah, I guess if we're kind of piling on Victor for a second, which seems fair enough. There's a line of thought that this novel is ultimately a critique of a certain kind of science or a certain kind of creativity, and so Victor really does seem in Mary Shelley's line of sight in a way. But I don't know, like when I used to live in Boston, there was always this recording on the subway that would say, if you see something, say something. And you kind of think, Victor has so many opportunities to describe to anyone, any sympathetic audience, a little bit about what's happening. And he constantly internalizes it. For an admittedly compelling point, if I tell them, they'll think I'm crazy. But you have to sort of wonder, if it would be worth the risk at some point to try to kind of explain or account for it. So I guess that's to me another part of the failure of relationality, that being in a relationship involves some amount of openness. And if you're going to travel with your best friend to England for 2 years to create a second human creature, you could at least, once say like, oh, by the way, while I'm in Scotland, I will be creating a life form out of body parts because I'm being blackmailed, and he doesn't. And that failure of communication, I think, is on him in a certain way.
We have two great minds thinking alike here. Arta asks, do you think that the narrative structure is of great importance? She mentioned she uses it as the perfect example to teach the issue of reliability. And from Christine, I love that the novel is circular in nature, starting with Walton's voice, switching to Victor, then the creature's voice, back to Victor, and finally Walton again. Additionally, the novel also brings up interesting discussions with my high school students. What does it mean to be human in light of modern medical technology? How many parts can be transplanted and the person remains the same person?
I think you're right. When I teach this at Ohio State, I teach it in our English 3398, the kind of methods for the English major course, because it is, such a great text to think about narrative structure. And it kind of is interesting how different students incline towards different pieces of the novel. And, I guess, I have a kind of an affinity for getting right to that middle part of the novel, which kind of seems like, the center of the chocolate, in this kind of rich way. But I'm always intrigued by, students who can figure out so much about the text by just sticking with Walton, trying to make it, through the Northern Passage. And to me, it seems one aspect of the openness of the novel, the way in which Mary Shelley can write, something that's so open to interpretation, that she kind of gives you those different levels to think with, each one of which, produces a set of questions, but all of them pointing back to that central question that you're suggesting. What does it mean to be a human being? Or as Mary Shelley puts it at a couple points, what does it mean to be a human creature? I love the way in which those terms get intertwined throughout the text, such that sometimes Victor is the creature, and sometimes the creature is the creature, and the creature is a monster. The monster is a human, and it really, it never lets you settle very comfortably. And if you figure something out in one part, you have to jump to another part of the narrative.
And I'll just add about the unreliability of the narration. I do know that several critics have pointed out that all of the characters speak in the same voice, which is a criticism, right? But in a way, I feel like it works really well in that if they're all given the same platform and given the same voice, it is really hard to tell, who's the monster and who's not the monster, who's reliable, who's not reliable. So I think that I don't think that's a negative, and I could be wrong, but that's my opinion.
I like to play a game in class where kind of in exactly the way Jim's describing it. The question is, who's speaking? Is it Victor or the creature? So you just kind of pull out a line and ask for to figure out who it is. So I mean, I know this isn't a kind of a live classroom, but I'll give you one, or one of my favorites. And I mean, I mean, I'm not sure I could figure it out if I hadn't pulled it out for everybody today. Okay, so here it goes. Here's the line. I was alone. None were near me to dissipate the gloom and relieve me from the sickening oppression of the most terrible reveries. And Victor or creature. I think in this case it's Victor, but I'm actually now second guessing myself because it could be either one of them. And I mean that simultaneity of perspective, but vast gulf of difference is also quite powerful.
So Joshua adds a comment. The fact that the voices sound similar could be since Victor is narrating his story to Walton. It further allows for some unreliability in the story. All right, and we have a collection of questions here about Victor. So could you see Frankenstein as a narcissist whose single self-absorption destroys everyone he loves or what he creates? And then who would you consider the villain in the novel? Is the creature a tragic villain, or is he solely a victim of his villainous and neglectful father?
Oh, I mean, that's like a harsher version of the "is Victor ineffective" question. But I mean, again, I mean, it seems fair enough. I mean, I don't have a good answer. I mean, like, it seems like, I mean, that again, it's like one of the $1 million questions that it would be fun to think about for like 3 hours of book club rather than our measly hour. But I think one way of sidestepping it, right? I mean, that seems to me what maybe part of the art of teaching is about, is like the elegant sidestep to leave you to struggle with it is Mary Shelley comes from a dense philosophical background. I mean, her parents are these brainy Enlightenment thinkers, and so much of the creature's narration of his own. I guess I'm approaching the question of, is the creature a villain or not? So much of his narration seems to kind of recapitulate some of the greatest hits of Enlightenment philosophy. So I mean, like education. How is the mind formed? How do we acquire language? How do societies develop in the world? And I mean, one thing that Mary Shelley seems to really want to draw on from Enlightenment moral philosophy is the idea that human beings are born benevolent, capable of good, or that there's a kind of natural human inclination towards sympathy, or sometimes called the moral sentiment, and that was a swerve from the way Thomas Hobbes and some other thinkers had approached the question, which was that we were born cruel, and life was nasty, brutish, and short, and self-interest drove us to do things in the world. And I think Mary Shelley wants to make it really clear that the creature was totally confused when it sort of randomly showed up on a November night in Germany, but that as it started to figure things out, it was a peaceable vegetarian who just liked to eat berries and learn how to talk and read books, and in fact like to do nice things for people. So you need some firewood, super fast creature who can like chop down trees way faster than you. So, here you are. And it's only as a last resort, that kind of moment of howling in the woods that Jen was pointing towards, that he claims revenge and cruelty as the thing that's going to be his new modus operandi. That up until that point, like all beings, until harmed by society, the kind of inclination was a benevolent one. So, I mean, if the creature is a villain, it's a choice that he makes in reaction to how he's treated, rather than any kind of like innate inclination or something like that. And that tendency towards benevolence, I mean, if you search through the text, benevolent is a word that comes up over and over and over again, and that's a preoccupation of the Enlightenment, but also of Mary Shelley's, I think.
Got a comment here from Arda. The creature seems to be a tragic figure, as we cannot really call him a victim, as he becomes active and engages in murder. He is a victim of his fate, much like Tess and Tess of the Dubervilles is, yet he becomes active and therefore becomes a tragic figure. In terms of a villain, it's very difficult to say who the villain is. Perhaps Victor is the villain and the creature becomes a reflection of his creator. Christine adds, who is speaking, Victor or the creature? Good question. My students often go a step beyond. Could Victor and the creature be the same person, similar to Jekyll and Hyde? Or could this all be Walton's delusion, since it is told in letters to his sister? More fun things to think about.
Oh, I like that one. I'm gonna think about that one a little bit more. I do have a passage that I underlined, thinking about the sort of that Jekyll and Hyde. I'm glad you brought that up, because I feel like sometimes we see flashes of the monster in Victor, like pretty intense flashes. And here's one that is volume 2. So I'm doing the 1931 edition. Oh, sorry, the 1818 edition. So he says, when I thought of him, I gnashed my teeth, my eyes became inflamed, and I ardently wished to extinguish that life which I had so thoughtlessly bestowed. So that flash, right? I just keep thinking of that just appearance of the monster within in that passage.
That's so great. I mean, is it all Walton's delusion? I mean, what else are you going to do to pass the time when you're stuck in the middle of the ice and, way up north? There was for the bicentennial of Frankenstein, there was a column in the Washington Post. I think her name is Alexandra Petrie. She does kind of humorous columns, and this was Walton's sister writes back in response to all of his letters, and as the letters keep getting longer and weirder, she just says like all these hysterical things back. One of which is like, frankly, your letters are too long. Like, could you please send me a shorter letter, because I actually have things to do in a family to take care of. So I think the possibility that it's all in kind of Walton's head is an intriguing one. After all, he does say, right, that he started out wanting to be a poet, and when he realized that he failed at that, he tried, being an explorer, which seems like not a very practical second plan B, but that desire to create imaginative fictions is there from the beginning. And he also basically says, I'm lonely and I really want a friend. It seems like he's very blatant about that. It's sad and quiet up here. We need something to occupy our time.
I'm into this. I'm going to think about this some more.
Juliana says, along those same lines, I've seen the take that the depiction of Frankenstein as a tortured genius is Mary Shelley's sly feminist take on the egos of men in her life. Thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly right in a way. It's hard to figure out who the target is. I feel like, I think that, like all of the egoist men in her life is a good way of putting it. Maybe her father in ways. Mary Shelley, if you read other of her novels, she is consistently preoccupied by the father-daughter relationship, which, doesn't loom very large in this text, but, kind of makes you think that could be there. And, Percy as well. I don't think it would take very long living with Percy Shelley to realize, what a narcissist he was. I mean, I don't mean to entirely throw him under the bus. He was an interesting thinker and that kind of thing. But I mean, just to kind of, I mean, I think you can encapsulate the Percy Shelley story in this way. I mean, he left his first wife and children to take up with Mary Shelley, and by the time she had started Frankenstein and they went back to England, his first wife had committed suicide, and so I mean, Percy Shelley's thoughtlessness leaves a lot of victims in its wake. I mean, would be one way of putting it. And if Mary Shelley didn't know that in 1816, she would have been, very aware of it, I think, by the time the book was finished and published in 1818.
And we have a comment from Arta. So comment on Juliana's question. 3 male narrators, no female response. We never see the letters of Walton's sister. Victor is a male scientist, creates the creature and fails to take care of it. The creature's companion is destroyed. And Joshua had a comment to add to our earlier conversation. The idea of Victor and Frankenstein and the Frankenstein's monster being the same has a brief moment in the 1910 edition, or Edison Frankenstein movie 2. It is very different from the book, but it shows people have been thinking about this idea for a long time.
If I just on the thought of the egos and narcissists, I mean one passage I just can't resist. I was reading it this morning and just thinking, like, I mean, it's very it's just incredible. Is Victor's letter to his fiancee Elizabeth, when he basically says, okay, let's finally get married. I mean, if you just when it kind of explains itself, as he puts it. My letter was calm and affectionate, and this is the letter. I fear, my beloved girl, I said, little happiness remains for us on earth. Great way to start your let's get married letter. Yet all that I may one day enjoy is concentrated in you. Chase away your idle fears. To you alone do I consecrate my life and my endeavors for contentment. I have one secret, Elizabeth, a dreadful one. When revealed to you, it will chill your frame with horror. And then, far from being surprised at my misery, you will only wonder that I survive what I have endured. I will confide this tale of misery and terror to you the day after our marriage shall take place. I mean, it's just, if you're looking for like narcissistic egoism, I mean, I think the idea that you could write a letter like that and expect anyone to say, "Oh, like great idea. Let's set the date and call the caterer." I mean, I think is a sign of how kind of one-sided his thought is. When I tell you my dreadful secret, then you will sympathize with me and wonder how I've endured all these years. Who cares? What you've endured, right?
I'll just add to that too. I mean, you can follow that trend when he's interpreting, Victor is interpreting the monster's threat against himself on his wedding night, not even considering that the monster might go after Elizabeth. And then I remember that other passage, which I did mark and I can't find it right now, when I think it's when he first goes off to university and he sort of says, well, Elizabeth wishes she could come too, but she can't. And I think that might be Shelley's little dig there. And, a lot of those ideas about women in education that she would have had came from her mother and her mother's writings, which she was very devoted to reading and consuming and sort of internalizing that.
Joshua asks, despite the connections to Prometheus in the title, I do wonder about the parallels to Heracles and his demise. Do you believe that was an intentional element on Shelley's part, creating further connections to Greco-Roman mythology? And would this connection have elevated her work in the public consciousness among her contemporaries?
That's a good, that's a great question. I don't know in particular, but the kind of the power of classical mythology seems something that Shelley is keen to exploit at every turn. So much so that and again, this is maybe a not very elegant sidestep, but Mary Shelley has another novel called The Last Man, which is about surviving a plague. And I've taught this a couple of times, and students are always like, "Why are we reading this long book?" And no, that's a question people won't really ask anymore. But I mean, Mary Shelley basically creates for the story a faux mythological framework where the conceit is that she visits a cave, and from the cave kind of dives down into this underground classical city that's buried under the water, and finds in that city the kind of like shards that have the story of the novel itself present. So in other words, Mary Shelley wants to make it seem as though her own novel is something that's classical and mythological. So I mean, I think she's aware that I mean, at this moment when like elite education is classical, that I mean, like kind of adding that mythological classical element does make it seem like a serious piece of literature. But I mean, that's not a great answer, Joshua, so apologies for the sidestep.
Jake, in your opening remarks, you mentioned The Year Without a Summer, and we had a question submitted in advance about the eruption of Tambora and how that added nuisance outside of what appears at the surface level, disease / misplacement / the other in the novel.
Certainly now, looking back, the kind of understanding the prompt for the novel is coming out of a massive climatological disruption. Kind of adds this power to thinking about the story. And I mean, for a novel that starts north of Russia, right, and travels to England, and I mean, it does seem to kind of like want to enclose as much of the globe as possible. So I mean, there's no sense that Mary Shelley was thinking about the eruption of Mount Tambora when she's writing Frankenstein. But I think, like, looking back to see it as part of that context kind of captures the way in which this is a kind of global story in its own right. And I mean, you even see in the preface, I mean, her kind of awareness of that climatological frame. It was dark and cold, and so we told these ghost stories. But then the weather started to clear up, and Percy and Byron decided to go on a trip and left me behind. It's basically kind of the story. I mean, I think when I've taught the text, I mean, that's something that students are really fascinated by. And in fact, I had one student who was like a dual English major and meteorology major, and it was so interesting to talk to her about Frankenstein, because it seemed to kind of have a climatological thing in the story of The Year Without a Summer, but also in the kind of opening sequence with Walton as well.
And our final question, and no rush, why does Frankenstein endure? I
mean, that's such a good question. Jen, do you want to answer it?
Oh, I'm not going to be able to answer it. I can offer some ideas. I think elements of the story endure. There's so many ways in, both for readers, but also for teachers. And I think, Jake and you and I talked about this before, that you can really take incidents and environments that are happening around us now at any time, since Shelley wrote this in 1818 or published in 1818, and really relate, because it's a novel about humankind. And I think there are all these elements as far as, judging an outsider and isolation and solitude and family, community, all of these elements. I think you can think about today in relation to our world today. I was thinking specifically rereading this during a pandemic. I know a lot of us have been going out into nature to restore ourselves while we were in isolation and quarantine, and we can see Victor doing that quite often, right? I feel like if Victor had an Instagram, we would see just pictures of lakes and mountains, and of course, nothing to do with his, creation and things like that. But I think, we would see a lot of those pictures. I think I'm just about annoying all of my followers with all my flower pictures on Instagram. But I think, we can really think about what's happening in our world today and find links to the themes and the topics covered in the novel. And I think that's one of the reasons.
Okay, I mean, I think there are several. So, I mean, there's all kinds of different things, which maybe speaks to the real, you know, skill and power of the novel. I mean, one, I mean, it transports us back to a time before science and literature were two distinct disciplines. You know, so in other words, you know, it really isn't. I mean, I was kind of making fun of him, but it's not all that funny that you know, Walton wanted to be a poet and then decided to be an explorer. I mean, I think this idea of all the disciplines being kind of integrated in this way is there, and certainly in the Romantic period. I mean, the fact that a lot of writers, I mean, Shelley's not the only one, are both interested in the you know, the state of the field of science, but also, you know, imagining creative works of literature, has meant that this text kind of always allows us or reminds us that imagination and science are kind of, you know, conjoined terms rather than not. So, you know, whatever the scientific reality of the day is, you know, Mary Shelley's, you know, novel can help remind you to imagine it. But I also think, I mean, it's a novel that raises a lot of ethical questions. You know, I mean, the creature at one point in time is, you know, kind of trying to convince Victor to make him a new creature, and he says, you know, I mean, you know, I mean, think about it. I am the person to whom thy justice and even thy clemency and affection is most due. So, you know, I mean, it poses ethical questions that are fun to think with. I mean, should Victor have created a second creature? I mean, it's, you know, it's a speculative thing that's fun to think about in class. You know, I mean, it's a challenge to student or anybody who's reading it. What would you do if you were in Victor's shoes, or what would you have done differently? I mean, I guess that. The last thing I'd say is, I mean, it has something to do with structure, or just the way the novel's put together. I mean, for one, it's short and action-packed. And I mean, a short novel, you know, it can do so much in that amount of space, but it, you know, it has a coming-of-age story in a way. It has, I mean, it's a bad love plot, but it has a kind of love plot. It you know, like Jen's saying, has a detective story and several mysteries. I mean, it just, or it has a kind of adventure, you know, exploration kind of. I mean, it has so many different things that we like to read. When you get to Frankenstein, you don't have to choose any one of them. They're just kind of all there, and you know, you know, in one chapter, kind of in one mode of thought, and in another one. And the fact that it's all pulled off so tightly and elegantly is just always satisfying to see and read. It's a great think piece.
Well, Jennifer and Jake, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us. This is a wonderful conversation. And thank you to all of you in the audience for joining us today and for sharing your really thoughtful questions and comments. Have a great afternoon. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.